Hey guys, Sean Dove here, and a little while ago I was sent the opening title sequence for a kids show called Figure It Out. And I was asked the question, how could we go about recreating a similar effect? This creative piece was made by the team over at Buck, and as someone who loves playing with perspective, I was pretty keen to give the whole thing a go. In the clip we see this skewed text being projected onto almost like an underground car park style scene, and then with a camera swing we start to see it line up before reading seamlessly on that end frame. Alright, so to try to do this, I thought we'll put together a real quick scene just using simple shapes, and then we'll try using some camera projection and perspective, and we'll see how it turns out. Alright, let's jump in. Okay guys, let's jump straight in and start trying to put together a little underground car park style scene ourselves. So to start with, let's drop a cylinder into our scene. I'm going to use this to be like those concrete pillars. Now a height of 200 should work well for us, but I'm going to reduce our radius to something like 25. Pull that down by about half. I'm also going to grab my cylinder and just pull it 100 centimeters up in Y space, holding shift as I do it to move at increments of 10. And now we're sitting perfectly on the floor. With our cylinder selected, I'm going to come up to MoGraph and feed this into a cloner. And we're going to change our mode from linear to grid array. Now we don't need any in the Y, so I'm going to pull this down to 1, and now we've got 3 in both X and Z. And you can start to see what's happening. We've been able to quickly create those concrete pillars. So first up, I'm going to increase my count on both the X and Z to about 4. And I'm also going to give these a bit more space. 350 is still keeping them pretty tight. We might need to push this a little bit further. I'm going to change it to per step actually. And then we're going to go 350 in both X and Z. And now we're just getting a bit more space around these actual pillars. Great, so like I said, we're going to build this really quickly and really simply, just to start to add a bit of geometry to our scene to give us something to play with here. So I'm going to close that up, and this is our concrete pillars. Nice, now we need the beams running across the top of these, connecting them to the ceiling. So I'm going to drop a cube into our scene. I'm going to jump into my 4 views for a second and frame it up. All right, I'm going to reduce our X height a little bit and pull it down a little bit on Y as well. Somewhere about there. So we've pulled it down a little bit on X, we've pulled it down on Y as well, and now we're just extending it along Z to make it about the same length that our concrete pillars are taking up. Nice, might just make this a little bit thinner. And somewhere about there is looking good for now. Now we just need to pull this up so it's sitting on top of those pillars. And then I'm just going to pull this all the way left of frame over those first row of concrete pillars. Great, so with our cube selected, we're going to do the same thing. Come up to MoGraph, come down to cloner, and then we will use a linear cloner this time, but not on Y. So let's reduce that height. Jump back into our 4 views. And we actually want to give this a bit more space along X. So we can actually dial in 350 because we know that's the same distance that our pillars are being separated by. We'll just increase our count as well, knock it up to 4, and that's going to complete that for us. Great, so our simple scene's starting to come together here. I'm going to add another cube to our scene, and we're going to be using this one to essentially start to form the shape of our room here. So I'm going to pull this up 100 units in space, and we actually need to make it a little bit taller to be able to capture those beams that we've set now. To keep our scene tidy here, I'm just going to rename our cloner to concrete beams. So if we jump into our beam, to make it clean, let's make our Y height 25. And that's going to be the extra height that we need to give our cube to capture that. Let's come into our cube and we'll make our Y 225. Now if we pull this up, we should be essentially capturing both the pillar and the beam. I know we didn't position that concrete beam exactly on top, but you guys are going to get the idea. Now let's increase this cube to fill both those beams and pillars. All right, great. So now that we've got this cube capturing all that, let's hit C to make this editable. I'm going to grab our polygon selection tool and just delete these 2 side faces for a second. So now we've essentially created a little room that we can start to have a bit of fun with. So what I was almost thinking is if we zoom in here, I want to create almost like a little ramp that's going to be in the front here, and we come up through that ramp to start to see that skewed text or logo or whatever we're going to end up using, and then we'll fly up before it finally hits that nice sweet spot. So let's start to put that together. All right, great. We've got a real basic little setup here. We might go and add a few extra little details like some air conditioning vents, maybe some pipes running across the ceiling. But for now, let's focus on getting this little ramp set up on the projection and seeing how we can bring that to life. So I'm going to swing out of here, and on our cube, we want to make a cut through this back wall. So I'm going to hit KL for loop cut. And as you can see, as I drag along here, it's going to make a cut wherever I select. So I'm going to make a cut, and then I'm going to come up to our plus tool and start increasing our count here. And as I do that, it's added an extra cut, but it's also repositioned them so they're perfectly spaced along that back plane. Beautiful. So we've now got a nice gap in the middle here. Let's just have another look through our camera and see where about that's lining up. And beautifully, that little hole we've created is right in the middle between our pillars here. So that's going to create a nice little ramp for us. So we'll select this middle plane on our back wall, and I actually might make it a little bit tighter. I don't think I want it going quite as wide. Great, so we've got this plane selected. I'm going to hit D for extrude and just extend this a little bit. We can actually come over to this offset and enter something like 350 just to pull that out a bit. What I'm going to do is frame up about where we want our end position to be, where we want it to be reading nice and seamlessly. So let's jump in here. Now I'm going to add a camera. Let's look through that. I'm going to change my focal length to 50. So maybe somewhere about there. We're starting to see a couple of those pillars. Great, so now that that's there, let's come to tags, Cinema 4D tags, and I'm going to add a protection tag just so we don't move this camera if we're ever looking through it. We want this to be set now because we're thinking this is going to be about where that final frame is going to be. We can come and tweak it, but for now, this is going to be just fine for us. Let's jump out of that camera, jump out of here, and what I'm thinking, we've still got this plane selected at the back from that little ramp. So if we pull that down, maybe something about 200 is going to work for us there. We might even want to extend this a little bit more. I'm just holding shift as I do that, again, to move it increments of 10. And great. And what I want here is for it to essentially almost open up into another car park space. So I'm going to hit D for extrude again and just pull this out. Grabbing these two outside faces now and doing the exact same, hitting D for extrude and just pulling on them. So they're about a similar size to our car park that we've set at the top. We're not going to be using this bottom space for anything more than the shadows. We're not going to be adding any extra detail to this bottom space. It's just to help fill that detail when we're looking through our camera. So let's have a look there. Great, we've now modeled a quick little ramp and just adding a bit of extra detail into our geometry here. Now the fun thing with this technique is the more you can add into your scene and interact with, it's fun to shift on that. It's fun to play with that perspective. So that's why we're introducing these beams, and hopefully we should be able to create something pretty cool here. Perhaps what we could do is add a sign at the top of this ramp that perhaps represents the exit sign or telling you which direction to go. So maybe let's add that in, and then we'll start to focus on the projection. So let's jump out of our camera for a second. I'm going to frame up a little garage window here and drop a cube into our scene. Actually, let's jump into our 4 views, and we'll pull this cube right over to the start of the ramp there. We can then make it a little bit thinner on X, maybe somewhere about 20. Y can be about the same, a little bit thicker, maybe something, let's go 80. Let's just make that 80 centimeters for now. And you know what, looks like 200 isn't working too bad for X. Actually, now that we're here, let's pull it down a little bit more, perhaps 60. Great, I'm just gonna pull this up in space. And this is nice, we're just getting that little bit of extra detail. Now we might go and add some chains or something hanging off this sign, but for now we've dropped the shape in, we've got some basic geometry to play with. I think it's time. Now in the example that we saw from Buck, they were using this technique for an intro title sequence, but I was also thinking we could pretty much use anything for this. So I wanted to have a play, just using my own logo to see if we can create some fun perspective with it. Great, so now that we've got our little scene set up, it's time to set up our little image projection. So I'm going to jump into Illustrator, and this is going to be where I'm going to set it up. So I'm going to create a new document. I'm going to make it 1920 by 1080 pixels, and this is the exact same size that our artboard is inside cinema. So I'm going to hit OK. I've got my little SD monogram here. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to drop it into our scene. And what we're looking at here is basically what our final frame is going to be. So we can scale this to about the same size that we ultimately want to be seeing it on that final frame. So I'm just going to scale this up a little bit more. Somewhere about there is looking good for me. So I'm going to come into File, Export, Export As, and I'm going to export this out as a PNG, but I'm also going to tick Use Artboard, and that's going to make sure we maintain that 16:9 ratio. I've also output this at 600 DPI just to add a little bit of extra quality because we are going to be skewing it and seeing it from different perspectives. So the more resolution we can get into it is only going to benefit us. I'm going to hit OK on that. And now we can jump back over into cinema. So now that we're here, we've already got a camera set up for where we want that final resting frame to be. So I'm going to grab that and make a duplicate. Let's look through this one. And I'm going to add a camera calibration tag to this one. So let's go Tags, Cinema 4D Tags, and add Camera Calibrator. And this is where we're going to feed in that image that we've just created. Now, it might be a little bit hard to see. I'm going to turn off my garage scene for a second. And now you can see we've got that little SD monogram here. I'm going to turn back on my garage scene. And now that we've got this image set, let's come over to Calibrate. And we're going to say Create a Camera Mapping Tag. So now that we've done that, we can take this tag and feed this on top of our garage. As soon as we do that, you're going to notice everything goes black and white, and we're not actually picking up any of the details of the garage anymore. So what we're going to need to do is jump into our logo, take this image, and also place it into the alpha channel. Let's turn that on, close it off again, and now we're just getting that image. So let's jump into our actual texture here, and in the luminance, we've got the image being fed into this channel, and that's what's making, and this is what's coloring our actual logo here. So let's clear that, close it off, and now we've got a perfect white logo. Now, if I hit render, you're not going to see a lot. We're just going to get the black and white. So while we're working here, to give ourselves a bit of extra detail, let's open up our render settings, and I'm just going to add some ambient occlusion. What this is going to do, it's going to help give us some real quick contact shadows, and already you can start to see we're getting those details of the actual tunnel there. And already this is starting to look kind of cool. Now to help with the rest of the scene, I've created another material, but instead of this being 100% white in the luminance, I'm going to pull this back a little bit, make it a bit, I'm actually going to turn off luminance altogether and just use color. But I'll pull this back, not to 100% black, but I do want a dark scene here. I'm also going to add some reflection. Let's add a beckon. Give it a little bit of fall off. Nice, and let's add that to our garage scene as well, but make sure it's going underneath your logo or your text file or whatever image you've actually brought in to do this technique with. Let's hit render. I'm going to tone those reflections right down. That was far too intense. Might even make my actual texture a little bit darker. Pull down on that specular channel and just roughen up our textures a little. Just roughen up this texture a little bit as well. Let's hit render again. Okay, we're still getting a very flat looking scene, and I think if we jump over into the physical renderer, just doing that might help us a little bit. What you might have noticed then is I've just turned off that default light because that was giving us some, it was giving us some real funky looking geometry here, whereas I kind of want our logo to almost be our light source. We can come in here and tell it to be an area light as well, and if we hit render again, we're not going to see a lot, but let's come back into our effects. And we'll just add some global illumination. And if we hit render on that now, it's going to take a little bit to think about it. We can pull back on those settings a little bit, but this is how we can start to set up, this is how we can start to use these textures as the actual light source in the scene as well. And I think that's a bit of fun. So as this comes through here, hopefully we'll start to see that SD forming more of a light source, and we'll be able to see the glow happening around some of those beams in our actual scene here. Now you can see by just using this in the default, our timer is ticking along down here. We're up at nearly 40 seconds before the image even starts to come through. So this is taking a little while, but that's when we've got heaps of blurry reflections and we're rendering quite a big scene here. It's to be expected. We can start to take some of those render hits. Now this quick tip was less about the actual lighting and the rendering of our actual video here. It was more about how we can start to set up these scenes. So this is all right. As I jump out of this camera now, we've got our little black underground garage little scene here, but we've also got our logo being projected, and as we spin around, we're able to see it at some pretty interesting angles, and this is where the real fun comes into it, where we can make these unrecognizable graphics slowly line up before reading seamlessly. So I think that's what we should have a look at, animating a little camera in our scene here, having a little animated camera swing. So I think what we'll do, let's add a camera into our scene. Let's add a camera into our scene at that perfect end frame. And I'm just going to use our timeline here. It's set to 90 seconds. I'm working at 30 frames a second, so that's going to be 3 seconds for us. And it's just going to be a quick little test. So let's add a keyframe there on our camera. Let's pull this back to frame 0. And now I'm just going to rotate this camera around a bit. Maybe somewhere about there. Maybe we're tucked in behind this pole, and then we start to swing out. So let's add a keyframe there. And now as I scrub through this timeline, you can see we're panning through the actual garage before hitting that sweet spot. So let's hit play. And by default, both those keyframes have a little bit of easy ease on them, and as we start to swing around. And just by default, this is kind of looking cool as it is. We could go and add some extra details, maybe some air conditioning vents and some pipes. Maybe there's something even on the ground in the foreground for it to sit on. So this is the real fun part. Anything we add into this garage hierarchy now will be affected by this. So if we add anything that is in the direct line of sight of this logo, we want to drop it into this little garage hierarchy. And that's how it's going to capture that texture. For example, if I just grab ourselves a sphere, and pull this down a little bit, and we know this is on the ground and it's hitting some of that texture. If I take that sphere and drop it into our garage hierarchy now, that texture is going to wrap around that sphere. And now, as we swing around this scene, still as we hit that final frame, it still reads seamlessly. So the more things we stack and add into the image here, it just creates more interest as you're actually swinging around it. So that's the basic idea of this technique. We could take it a little bit further and go and add some concrete textures to actual pillars here, and really enhance it by going that extra mile and fine-tuning some of those textures rather than just this flat look that we've set up at the moment. But this is just to demonstrate the technique, get you thinking about some different ways to use that camera calibrator. So I think this was a pretty quick setup, and of course we can go and add some extra details, but I'm pretty happy with where this has ended up as far as being able to have a bit of fun using that camera calibrator and trying it out in some different ways. And I think using it for these perspective kind of things is really powerful. As always, this could be pushed a lot further, but we've set up some good groundwork to really have a bit of fun with this. Lastly, this is another scene I was having a bit of a play with, and I wanted to try this technique using a piece of graphic artwork. So to do so, I reached out to a very talented illustrator by the name of Oliver Santiago, and I asked him if I could use one of his pieces to demonstrate how we can use this perspective to try and create some fun results. He very kindly supplied me with this 8K res version of his lip art from his Drip series, so thanks heaps, mate. And guys, make sure you go and check out his whole series. It's absolutely insane. His link will be in the description. Thanks again, mate. Now this scene when I was having a bit of a play was set up much the same as we just did, but rather than using the camera calibrator to set up that projection, I actually used the camera projection within our actual texture and then fed in our locked off camera, which is positioned on that final frame. And then we can add in a secondary camera and use that to fly around our scene, and we know that projection is going to be locked off. And even this animation was much the same, created a nice little swing, but what you might notice is I've actually animated the focal length as well. So on our final frame, we've projected it back onto the geometry using a 24mm focal length. So that'll be my final resting length, but then at the start, I've actually bumped it up a bit, and I'm using a 50mm, and it allows us to punch in a little bit more on the actual graphic, and it creates a little bit more and it makes it come across a little bit more abstract and unrecognizable until we do get to that final frame and it starts to line up. And that's just another way to start layering in some extra details. You can see this one's pushed a little bit further. We've got some beams running across the ceiling. We've got a little garage door in the back there, and it's all these extra details that are really going to help bring it to life a bit and ultimately make for a bit of fun playing with this perspective. Alright guys, I think that's pretty much it. Of course, if there's something you're trying to attack and you'd like a little bit of extra help, reach out and we'll see if we can't figure it out together. Remember, if you do create anything, make sure you share it with us. I'd absolutely love to see it. And guys, I'll see you again soon. Cheers.